Could your congressman pass an FBI security check? That's the question that Trevor Loudon asks in his new film, The Enemies Within, based off of his book with the same title, The Enemies Within, Communists, Socialists, and Progressives in the U.S. Congress. Loudon's film exposes the far-left, outright Marxist-Leninist and Islamic connections of various members of the U.S. Congress. Trevor, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Great to be here, Christian. Thanks for having me.
So, Trevor, I'd like to ask you, when did you get started in this interest in communism?
Look, it really started back, I've got to say, reading in New Zealand, reading JBS literature back in the early 70s. I read books like The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen and several books recommended or published by the JBS. But it really became personal for me in 1984 when we elected a socialist Labour government in my country. And one of the very first things they did was to ban nuclear warships from our harbours. Now, we had a military alliance with the United States up to that point, the Australia, New Zealand, United States Military Alliance, ANZUS. And there was a very strong pro-American feeling because we had been saved during World War II from invasion by the Japanese, by the US military. So they banned nuclear warships, it destroyed the alliance with the United States, and there was a lot of debate in the papers at the time. Oh, the peace movement are communist, they're working at the behest of Moscow, they want to drive a wedge in the Western alliance. And of course the peace movement was saying, no, we just love peace, we want an independent foreign policy for New Zealand. We don't want nuclear war. We want our kids to live free. And so a friend of mine who was one of the early computer geeks, we went down together and we went to the local library and poured through all the peace movement publications and put the names on a database. Then we went down to the library and found the Communist Party publications and got all the bylines and all the names, and we put those in a database. And guess what? There were matches all over the place.
So these are communist front groups posing
they were completely
as peace organizations.
But even more so, from that point, I contacted a gentleman who had infiltrated the New Zealand Communist Party for our security services. And he was, basically he infiltrated the labour union movement in Wellington in New Zealand. He was a tanker driver, got recruited into the Communist Party, and in 1983 he was sent to Moscow to train at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning. This was the major communist school from around the country. There were about 6,000 around the world. There were 6,000 students there at any one time. And he was, the context of the time was the Soviet Union was trying to destroy NATO in Europe. They had massive anti-NATO marches going on, and it was all through Europe, ban the bomb, big rallies, they had Greenham Common going. Their goal was to destroy NATO because that would give them a free hand in Europe. So what they discussed in Moscow with this delegation of New Zealand communists was, how about we use New Zealand as a wedge here? How about we drive New Zealand out of the Western Alliance, which will give impetus and encouragement to the anti-NATO movement in Moscow. Now these guys are chess players, you know. Take a pawn here, over here. So that's what they did. They formulated some slogans. It was all about, there was nothing anti-American about it. It was all New Zealanders standing up for peace. New Zealanders striking independent foreign policy course. New Zealanders standing against the nuclear arms race. And they took those slogans back to New Zealand. They held secret meetings with the peace movement in New Zealand, with the Labour Party, which they'd heavily infiltrated, and with the labour unions. And in a few short months, they had Moscow's legislation passed in New Zealand. And the military alliance with your country was dead and still has not been revived. But the big lesson I was taught is from my contact was that much of what we find as mainstream policy in the West, coming from the left, like say the American Democratic Party, the Canadian Liberal Party, the British Labour Party, the German Social Democratic Party, that comes from the communist movement. The communists formulate a policy, they make it labour union policy because they control the labour unions all over the Western world, and the labour unions make that policy Social Democratic policy or American Democratic Party policy or Canadian Liberal Party policy. So that is why we have Obamacare. That is why we have normalization of relations with Cuba. That is why we have a nuclear deal with Iran. That is why we have a big push for illegal immigration amnesty. All of these are communist policies that are made union policies, and the unions make them Democrat policy. And that is what I learned from my investigation into communism in New Zealand, and that's the lesson I applied when I started investigating communism in this country.
What led you to transfer your research from communism infiltrating New Zealand to the United States?
Well, as my friend would always say, you know, that the Soviets always regarded the United States as the #1 enemy. Everything else was peripheral. If you're going to get world domination, you have to take down America. There was no two ways about it. And he said an interesting thing. He said, back in the Cold War, no American was allowed to train at the Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning. Your government had warned Moscow, had any Americans ever been caught training there, there would be war. And the Soviets respected that. But what they would do is train Canadians or Mexicans who would then go and train the American communists. So I started investigating the American Democratic Party, the communist parties here, and when I was doing that in March 2007, I discovered a document that was talking about a Hawaiian communist named Frank Marshall Davis and his links with a young black guy in Hawaii called Barack Obama.
That sounds familiar.
It sounds very familiar. And the context of this article, they talked about how this meeting, this relationship, would be reviewed by historians in future times as very significant. Now, this was early 2007. Obama was just a blip on the radar at that point. You know, he wasn't anywhere near the Democratic Party nomination, but I knew from that point that he was going to likely be the nominee because the communists were clearly sending a message to their people, he is our chosen one. We're going to back this man. Hillary Clinton's going to be sidelined and this is going to happen. And sure enough, it came to pass. So that's when I really started investigating the American communist movement. I got very intense about it because I could see that America was about to elect a pro-communist president, and the implications of that were, you know, pretty serious.
We're still recovering from the ramifications of that.
Well, we still are. We all are, and every Western country was affected by it.
Now, you mentioned the Democratic Party and the election of Barack Obama and Frank Marshall Davis, but also in your film, you show a clip of John F. Kennedy during a debate for the presidency, I believe from 1960, where President Kennedy, a Democrat, is there condemning the communists and talking about how communism is a threat. So how did the Democratic Party shift from being a party that once, at least publicly speaking, perhaps their policies did not match what they said, but how did the Democratic Party go from John F. Kennedy warning about the dangers of communism in 1960 as a candidate to openly electing someone like a Barack Obama with connections with Frank Marshall Davis, or having a Bernie Sanders type with his ties reach that height and prominence within the DNC?
Yeah, it's a fascinating transformation. Frank Marshall Davis used to absolutely criticize Harry Truman back in the 40s for his anti-communism. You know, Harry Truman, the Democrat. So what happened, there was a very slow infiltration over many years of the Democratic Party by the communists. And they would infiltrate some aspects of the Republican Party too, back in the 40s. Frank Marshall Davis had been a Republican at one stage. A lot of black communists joined the Republican Party back in the 40s and 50s because it was the party of Lincoln. You know, and so they would use that. But after the 60s and the 70s, after the Civil Rights era, it was the Democratic Party that was most heavily targeted. And this went into overdrive in the 90s after the so-called collapse of communism, because in 1994, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is your largest Marxist group and is a crypto-communist organization, they got their member, John Sweeney, elected to the presidency of the AFL-CIO. Now, previously to that, the AFL-CIO had been run by hardcore anti-communists like Lane Kirkland and George Meany. But this new group, there was 4 or 5 of them leading it, directed by DSA, took over the AFL-CIO in 1994 and changed directions. The first thing they did was to eliminate the anti-communist clause from the AFL-CIO's constitution. Communists had been banned from the organisation up till then. The Marxists and communists came flooding back in, and they took over every major labour union. SCIU, AFSCME, United Auto Workers, you name it, they run it. So the significance of that is simple. Though organised labour in this country now is maybe 11-12% of the workforce, it's nothing like it once was. There's hardly an elected Democrat in this country, from county commission to federal level, who does not owe his job to the unions. So by taking over the unions, you could effectively influence the direction of the Democratic Party, because the Democrats rely on the unions for money, for manpower, for get out the vote, even for vote fraud. It's the unions who provide that muscle, money and manpower. So they started to purge, from 1994 on, they started to purge the Democratic Party of moderate elements, centrist elements. That sort of, you know, Joe Lieberman, the senator from Connecticut, was probably the last true moderate to be expelled from the Democratic
Moderate
Party.
in the sense that he didn't go as far left as his other contemporaries.
And they had already gone left. You know, this is not the Democratic Party of Larry McDonald or someone of that nature. It had already been moving left from the 60s onwards, and the left contingent was getting bigger and bigger by the year, but it went into absolute overdrive after 1994 because the unions were now under communist control. And so they started dictating policy. They started telling the Democrats who to elect. They started primering out and getting rid of moderates. And now they really own that party.
So you mentioned the Democratic Socialists of America and various communist elements in Congress. Who would you say, in your estimation, is the worst member of the U.S. Senate with the most extensive communist ties and the most dangerous member of the House of Representatives?
Well, if we start with the House of Representatives, I'd say it has to be John Conyers. Now, he's an octogenarian out of Michigan. He's been in Congress over 50 years now. But the reason I say he is the most dangerous is because he has been head of the Judiciary Committee for many, many years. And he's now the ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee. Now, that's the most important committee in your Congress because it writes federal law. But the other aspect, which is very significant for national security, it is the body that oversees the FBI and sets its budget and priorities. Now, John Conyers has a 50-year history with the Communist Party USA. His father before him was involved. He has a 40-year history with Democratic Socialists of America. He's been a card-carrying member of that organisation, spoke at its founding conference, still involved today. He's got a 30-year history with the Workers' World Party, which supports North Korea, Iran and Cuba, and he's got extensive ties over the last 15 years with several known Muslim Brotherhood front groups, CARE, ISNA, ICNA, etc. John Conyers is a hardcore anti-American Marxist-Leninist, yet he oversees the budget of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So what do you think's going to happen if somebody comes along from the FBI and says, look, we want to investigate that congressman because we think he's got ties to Cuba. This congressman's been working with the Muslim Brotherhood. This one has got very close ties to the Chinese. What do you think John Conyers is going to do? And it's not just Conyers. You've got Judy Chu on the Judiciary Committee, who was formerly allied with the Communist Workers' Party, a militant pro-Chinese outfit. She's China's best friend in Congress. You've got Luis Gutierrez, who's heavily involved with the communist movement, heavily involved with CARE, and was a former leader of the pro-Cuban Puerto Rican Socialist Party. And you've got Jerry Nadler from New York, who has been a card-carrying member of Democratic Socialists of America. So you've got 4 Marxists at least on the Judiciary Committee. So the FBI comes to the Judiciary Committee and says, we want to investigate this congressman or that congressman or whatever. What's going to happen? Nothing. There was a recent bid in the last Congress to introduce House Resolution 3892, which would have made the Muslim Brotherhood a designated terrorist organisation. It would shut down CARE and ISNA and ICNA and Muslim Students Association. Guess who led the charge to stop that on the Judicial Committee? John Conyers. I've got him on tape saying, the Muslim Brotherhood, it's forsworn violence. Now it's just a social service agency. We shouldn't be shutting them down. This is John Conyers. This is the role that they do. These congressmen are basically working for the enemy inside your Congress. But the important thing to remember, everybody's got to know this. Anybody who applies for a federal government job in this country probably has to undergo an FBI background check. And they can be rigorous. They can go through your underwear drawers. They check out your family background, overseas travel, political affiliations, criminal convictions, bounce checks. But if you're a Marxist radical like John Conyers or Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut or Danny Davis from Chicago, you can get elected to Congress as a Democrat and you can serve on the Homeland Security Committee or the Armed Services Committee or even the Intelligence Committee of the House of Representatives, overseeing all 16 of your intelligence agencies, and you need no background check whatsoever. None. Do you think your enemies might be aware of that? So you get into Congress, there's no background checks, and if somebody comes after you, John Conyers and his buddies will shut it down.
You mentioned Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut.
Yep.
How dangerous would you say she is in all of this?
She's right up there, probably number 2 behind Conyers, because she's on the committees that allocate Democratic congressmen onto committees. She helps to decide who goes onto the Armed Services Committee, who goes onto the Intelligence Committee, who goes onto the Education Committee. She has got an extensive background with the Connecticut Communist Party. She holds meetings in their headquarters on a regular basis. She knows all the leaders on a first name basis. I've got several photographs of her hugging the leader of the Connecticut Communist Party, Joel Fishman. And Joel Fishman is the leader of the Political Action Committee of the Communist Party USA. That is the body that is supposed to liaise with the Democrats to make sure as many left-wing congressmen get elected as possible. So that is the woman who works directly with Rosa DeLauro, who allocates Congress members onto sensitive congressional committees.
So before you mentioned that the Democrats have been, well, that the communists through the unions have been purging the Democrats of any type of centrist or moderate-leaning individual. So you would say it's Rosa DeLauro's job in the House to sort of wean out any people that may be like that who do get elected from having any key positions.
Yeah, she will put them into some obscure post, or, you know, she won't put them on the Defence Committee. If they're a moderate, they're not going to go on the Defence Committee. They're not going to go on Homeland Security or Intelligence. You've got, say, Keith Ellison on the Intelligence Committee, who has got extensive ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. You had Luis Gutierrez on there, who was a founder of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. You got Jim Himes, also of Connecticut, who did his thesis on the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, and a very favourable thesis at that. So that is Rosa DeLauro's role, in my opinion, to make sure the right people get on the right committees, and she is best friends with the Communist Party member whose job it is to work with the Democrats to get as many left-wingers into positions of power as possible.
So with someone like a Rosa DeLauro in the Democratic Party, the Democrats probably would never allow someone like Dov Hikind from Brooklyn, Democrat assemblyman, to ever make it to the House of Representatives, since he's
No, look, if you're...
he's probably the last conservative Democrat in any legislative body in the country.
Well, there are a few at lower levels and at county commission levels and that, but nobody who has conservative or even moderate views is going to get any key position in today's Democratic Party. It just will not happen.
Now, you mentioned that in 1984 that the AFL-CIO removed its ban on 1984
yeah.
on members of the Communist Party. Now, there's a bill currently in the California legislature to remove California's ban on members of the Communist Party from being involved in the state government. What's your take on that bill there?
Well, a couple of years ago they did a bill to, and a few years ago they did a bill to make it so teachers who are members of the Communist Party could stay in public service in California. And the key driver of that bill was a man called Alan Lowenthal, who was in the state Senate at that time, is now a congressman from California. He is the man who went to Cuba in 1985 to examine Cuban psychiatric practices and wrote very favorably of them. So I think it's very clear, and I don't know who's driving this latest bill, I haven't investigated it yet. It is very clear that this is a bill to just make it absolutely sure that none of their friends in the future can get persecuted for their views. Because California is absolutely riddled at every level with communist activists, many of them in the state Senate, many of them in the state House. And California is really effectively a Marxist state now. But they just want to make it sure that their friends can always be protected. So it's a symbolic gesture in some way to the comrades to make you're our friends now, you're okay. You're not going to be ostracized any longer. But there's a practical significance as well. They don't ever want anybody to be nailed for their communist affiliations. But the big flaw in these laws too is, see, back when they were crafted, there was a Communist Party. Now there are 30 Communist parties in America. Democratic Socialists of America is a Communist Party. Party for Socialism and Liberation, Workers' World Party, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, International Socialist Organization. All of these people have people in government positions at various levels in California and many other states. So when we get sane about national security again, it shouldn't just be the Communist Party, it should be, do you belong to any organization that in any way seeks to overthrow the US Constitution? That would also encompass organizations which promote Sharia law, for instance, which is also in direct violation of the US Constitution. You know, when I came to this country, I had to swear I had never been involved in any communist or fascist organization that sought to overthrow the US Constitution. That's still on the books for immigrants. Well, I think it should be on the books for public servants too, and should be broadened to be updated to suit the modern threats.
Now, you mentioned in your film, you discuss that if the U.S. were to be taken up by the communists, powers like Russia and China, Iran, North Korea would carve up the rest of the world in their image. Now, in your estimation, would you say that Vladimir Putin is a communist or a Leninist?
Absolutely. Look, very recently he was involved in, there's an old Soviet front called the World Federation of Democratic Youth. Now that brings communist young people from all over the world to gatherings in leftist countries around the world. The last one I think was in Ecuador. Before that it was in South Africa. They started having them in Eastern Europe in the 1950s. These are big gatherings of communist youth from all over the world. The next one is going to be in Sochi in Russia. And Vladimir Putin personally organized that. That was his thing. He went to them and said, we want you to come to Sochi. He went to their meetings, organizing meetings, and got it done. You know, we have this, you know, if you look at, say, Germany after World War II, the Americans, victors, went in there and they completely denazified the country. Nobody who'd ever been a Nazi Party member was ever allowed to hold public office again. When the Soviet Union so-called collapsed, there was never a de-KGBization of the country. The KGB, those Leninists who ran the KGB, are more powerful today than they ever were. Vladimir Putin still works very closely with Gennady Zyugaev, the head of the Russian Communist Party. They cooperate extensively. You know, what did they, you know, all of the old networks are still out there. You know, the World Federation of Democratic Youth, the World Peace Council, the World Federation of Trade Unions, all those old Soviet fronts are out there. The Russians are still working with their old allies, the Venezuelans and the Cubans and the Chinese. You know, the Chinese and the Russians are allied with Iran in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a military, economic and political alliance. You know, Vladimir Putin might not emphasize communism very much, but you'll notice that the Red Army parades that you see in Moscow today, they've brought the hammer and sickle back. They've brought the red flag back. Communist iconography is returning to the old Soviet Union, and the old networks are still very much in play. There's a group, we had a big kerfuffle in the election about Donald Trump's connections to the Russians. And I have no doubt that the Russians were trying to influence the election. But right now there's an organization in Russia called the Anti-Globalization of Russia, headed by a man called Alexander Ionov. It is directly funded by the Putin regime. It brings communists from all over the world to Moscow and some Nazi-type groups as well to create an anti-American international alliance. Several people who have attended conferences and with that organization led the anti-Trump protest movement in this country. People from the Workers' World Party, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, the leaders of the anti-Trump movement are directly connected to a Putin-funded think tank in Russia, which is used to promote communism and anti-American thought all over the world and activities. So the game is still playing. The old Cold War never ended, just they're a little more subtle about it, and they gave up that label communism. They gave up that radical pose to achieve the radical ends.
So what do you make of the mainstream media and the left's obsession and fascination that President Trump has alleged ties with Russia, that he is a puppet of Putin?
Well, the Russians certainly tried to get people around him, like Carter Page and others who had deep ties to the Russians. And Trump very wisely got rid of those people. So I think that's great. But see, you know, what did Lenin say? What did Alinsky say? Criticize others for what you're doing yourself. The Democrats have been in bed with the Soviet Union and Russia for more than 50 years. They have been working with the Russians to influence elections in this country for decades. You know, Hillary Clinton was so in bed with the Russians through the Skolkovo Foundation, it's just unbelievable. So what do? We are totally guilty of Russian associations. So let's call out Trump for doing it. Put all the attention on him, take the attention off us, and we look really cool. We're national security hawks now. We're standing up for America against Vladimir Putin, when they've been in bed with Vladimir Putin and his predecessors for 50 years now. You know, it's the ultimate scam. It's the ultimate.
If Hillary had won, it would have been actually worse, because she was behind the New START treaty that benefited Moscow, and the uranium deal that you mentioned. So Hillary's ties with Putin are far deeper,
and far more dangerous, and I would say illegal. You know, Barack Obama's ties. You know, he was mentored by Frank Marshall Davis, a pro-Soviet patriot. He got his first job in the Illinois State Senate through his pro-Soviet mentor, Alice Palmer, who was a member of the World Peace Council, the International Organization of Journalists, and other Soviet fronts. He had pro-Soviet people around him his entire career. And that famous statement that he made in South Korea when he was caught off mic with Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian president. When I get re-elected, I'll have more flexibility to deal with you. And Medvedev says, yes, I understand. We will pass your message on to Vladimir. We are with you. Now, you compare that to Donald Trump's alleged ties. That is an open admission that Barack Obama was basically talking to his bosses. And the media, oh, that's okay. That's nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. So this is the mainstream media in this country. The mainstream media is so in the tank for the left. They will follow the leftist line anyway. They have no credibility left. The media in this country has been in the tank for the communists and the Russians since the post-war era.
And if people want to learn more about this, they can pick up your movie, The Enemies Within, now on DVD. Now, if I may ask one last question, what's next on your agenda? What's the next project you're working on that you want to admit to, at least in this interview at the moment?
Well, look, we're doing a short movie right now on Antifa, the radical thugs that you see beating up people on the streets of Berkeley, etc. But the really important project, we want to do a series of Enemies Within movies. We've done one on Congress and the Senate, but that's not the only problem area in American life. So we're seeking funding now, we're looking for funding because the next project we want to do is Enemies Within the churches. We want to look very directly at the communist, Marxist and socialist infiltration of the mainstream and even some of the evangelical churches in this country, exposing their ties way back to the communist movement, the historical context of this, but right to the current day and the way they have perverted Christian teachings. They have placed their people in key posts in theological colleges, etc., and are basically working to bring the churches under communist control, just like the Russian Orthodox Church and the Islamic mosques have been brought under control inside Russia.